I'm so delighted to be here with this great panel to talk about what do employers really want. I think that's like the gajillion-dollar question, right? If we knew, we could fix our issues. I'm going to start out with just a couple little housekeeping items. First, of course, to thank the sponsors of EdPalooza for making this conversation possible this afternoon. And also to note the chat function, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with now, having all of us been doing this for some months, but we hope that you'll engage with the panelists in that way. Put your questions in the chat. We will look through them and try to get through as many as possible. We've saved some time at the end of the panel discussion to take your questions. So, and of course, to join the conversation via social media with the hashtag EdPalooza. So just to start the conversation before I turn it over to my colleagues to do a little self-introduction, I just wanted to start out with a little bit of course saying thank you for allowing the Chamber to be a part of this conversation. As I said, I am with the Chamber Foundation, but also with the U.S. Chamber doing policy on education and workforce. And, this issue of the skills gap and ensuring that we have alignment between what is taught both at the K through 12 level, but in higher education as well, and training programs aligns with what employers need is certainly a key challenge for us, and one that, as the session description describes, is one that we've all been thinking about and working on and working towards for the last few years. Just briefly, the Chamber, and the Foundation probably 5-6 years ago sort of said, what can we do different? If the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, we were continuing to get the same result by continuing to do what we are doing, which is by and large, really, I think, unfairly leaving it to the education system, the sort of the supply side, to fix the problem. Without really digging into the demand side and to the employer side and saying, what do they need to be doing differently so that we are better communicating what it is we need and want. And so we created, based on the principles of supply chain management, which employers know really well, and manage their supply chains along many things, just hadn't been doing it when it comes to talent. And so that is a set of strategies, an academy, a curriculum that we have been bringing to the employer community for the past 5 or 6 years. And that really is the idea being, we need to start with employers. They need to get their house in order in terms of communicating, being data driven, being very intentional about the jobs that are open, the skills, the competencies, the credentials that they require, doing all of that, and then going to their preferred partners to work with them to really build that real career pathway into jobs as opposed to sort of theoretical. So that is the work that we have been doing on the Chamber Foundation side. So hopefully that's relevant to this conversation today. And I will stop there, and I'm going to, as I said, turn it over to this fantastic group of ladies and ask them to do a little self-introduction, and then we'll get into conversation and some questions. Who do we want to start with? How about you, Grace?
I'll start, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Wonderful to be with you, Cheryl, and Lillian and Heather. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to EdPalooza. I'm Grace Sue. I'm Vice President for Education with IBM Corporate Social Responsibility. Been at IBM now for 25 years. I can't believe it. Our portfolio spans K through 12 through early college and adult upskilling and reskilling. And everything that we're doing is through the lens of education equity and workforce inclusion. our work is always about public-private partnership. We collaborate with policymakers and educators and nonprofit leaders in order to be able to make change at scale. And we do believe that public-private partnership is one of the most powerful forces for change. And in line, Cheryl, with what you're saying, we're really thinking about strategies around hiring as part of our workforce inclusion efforts, and have adopted a new collar strategy company-wide, which is a focus on skills and not just pedigree, and not just making those statements, but really working now with educators to ensure that we build a diverse set of talent to come work at IBM and to influence other companies as well.
Thank you. Lillian, you want to go next, and then we'll...
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lillian Hartgrove. I am currently chairman of the Tennessee State Board of Education. I've been serving on the board for 7 years, and the past 3 years as chairman of the board. I was formerly vice president of workforce development and education programs. I worked for a multi-county economic development organization. And it was in that position that I had a lot of interaction with employers and came to know the real challenges that they were facing in finding the workforce that they needed. And they were getting very frustrated with us, because I worked for a Chamber of Commerce and this economic development organization. And we were constantly working diligently to bring new companies to town, new employers who certainly were going to need their workforce. And so the employers that were already here as existing industry were frustrated with us, frustrated with their inability to find the workforce that they needed. So I had the opportunity to move from the economic development side, the pure economic development side, to the workforce development and education side to address the challenges, because to be successful in economic development, you do have to have a strong workforce development and education program addressing the real challenges. And if you can prove and demonstrate that you're actually doing that, then I think we're on a better path to winning and proving to employers that we're taking care of them and addressing their needs. I too am thrilled to be on this panel with Grace and Heather, and to meet Cheryl with the Chamber of Commerce. And I do want to thank ExcelinEd and the organizers of EdPalooza. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Lillian. Heather.
Yeah, I will echo Grace and Lillian's comments as well. Super grateful to be here. Heather Justice, I'm the Director for Career Readiness at Education Strategy Group, focusing there on building career pathways that are both K-12 education, higher education, and workforce aligned. It's really the intersectionality among those. Previous to that, I was in the state lens. So I was at the Texas Education Agency as the Division Director for College, Career, and Military Preparation, literally dealing with all of those things and working with state workforce boards and higher education institutions to build those pathways that were employer-driven as well. And then prior to that, I was actually in Tennessee at the Tennessee Department of Education as the Executive Director for Career and Technical Education, doing similar work. So excited to be a part of this conversation and kind of talk about where those intersectionalities meet and where they have a little bit of gap.
Great. Thank you, guys. So let's just dive into a few questions and hopefully get this just a free flow conversation going. So I think one of the big things is sort of, are we working towards the same vision? When I say we, the employer community and schools. So wanted to know sort of from your perspective, why do you think employers want to engage with schools, and why do schools want to engage with employers? It's sort of maybe a softball to start. Heather, I'll go to you.
Sure. I think the answer is sometimes it's done quite well, right? And then other times, I think what can sometimes start as altruism and a sense of giving back from an employer perspective can end up being even more. I think like why employers want to engage, if we're also being honest, if there's an understanding of strong current technical education programming, is because employers want to build their pipeline. And if there's a strong connection from the education side, I think it's because, not to refer to students as products, but that school systems want to ensure that the product they're delivering is actually meeting those expectations and making sure that those two kind of collaborate. But I do think in a lot of instances, it does start with a wanting to connect and give back, but then kind of starting at the fruition of, and then how do we actually get down to the knowledge and skills and what employers actually need and how our schools are delivering that.
Which is a good sort of segue to you, Grace, because I think we see this a lot at the chamber, which is that idea that it might start out as altruistic or giving back or corporate philanthropy or social responsibility, which I know is where you sit, but now it's definitely a shift of like, there's a pipeline issue. So it's a business decision as well. So Grace, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Heather, in the best partnerships, yes, the mission and goals are the same. I think obviously it is about talent, and employers are looking for the very best talent with the set of skills that are going to enable them to remain competitive, and not just remain competitive, but really to innovate. And obviously we understand the preeminent role that schools have in developing the leaders and workers who are going to enable us to do that, but also, a set of customers who are going to create demand for what it is that we're delivering. So I think, having a community of well-educated learners and talent is critical for employers, and that's a big reason that we get involved. I think there's a really growing understanding too about the importance of diversity as well, and employers are paying attention, especially given all that's happened over this past year with Black Lives Matter and social justice issues, and an understanding that we have to develop talent from more than traditional places that we look, and that to be truly innovative, we have to embrace diversity. And then, of course, I think, and that enables us to really target and focus on a broader set of schools. And in that way, I think we are becoming more in line with educators who are really committed to making sure that we're developing talent across the board, and making sure that we serve all students.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Lillian?
Well, I'll jump in and tell you all that from my perspective, it's not happening across the board. It certainly has been a challenge, and we work very diligently to engage employers. I'd have to say that we could prove our success by getting employers engaged with our work, and school districts by bringing them all together, bringing them to the same table and sitting down and actually having open and honest communication, lots of discussion, and more importantly, truly listening to each other and hearing what each other had to say. Because I can tell you, some of the first meetings that we had when we were bringing employers together, I thought they were going to, literally buck horns, but it was important to be honest and to say what they really felt so we could get on the other side of it and get into solution-oriented approaches to how do we address the challenge of preparing students for life after high school, and whether it's going to college or it's going into an actual career. But when we brought the people together, we literally asked them to commit to this work, and everyone had to know and understand clearly what the objectives were, what the outcomes were, and that we were not going to be all talk, that we were going to be action oriented. And in building these strong collaborations over years, and by proving that we were action oriented, we were able to bring more employers to the table. There are those that will not come to the table, and they have their own issues. Some of them will continuously tell you they're just simply too busy. However, they still cannot find what they're looking for, and they've yet to make that leap and come to the table and realize that by having their voices heard, then they are actually part of the solution and can help be on the path to getting what they actually need. So it's not where it needs to be across the board, but here where I've been having the opportunity to work with employers and educators, they're on the same page for the most part, sharing the same vision and outcomes.
You're a little bit lucky, I think, Lillian, in the sense that you do have a really engaged employer community in Tennessee, I think. At least my experience has been, especially with chambers, like they're willing to do the work, which is a good sort of segue into where are the breakdowns in these partnerships and how do we think, what are the ways to sort of prevent or address these breakdowns? And I know for us, one of the sort of key reasons that we got involved in this, it sounds like you've already thought this through, Lillian, really well, is this idea that like the traditional way to engage employers is to invite a handful of them to an advisory board, right? And then they generally sit there and they don't speak. They're too busy, or frankly, they don't who did they actually send to the meeting? Is the right person from the employer to actually be the decision maker? And so things just break down. It's not, if I've talked to two employers, I've talked to two employers. That is not a sufficient sort of, understanding of what the needs of the community are. And so I think that was sort of our approach, was we need to figure out how to really get them sort of organized as employers to come together with a vision and a set of needs. So that was sort of one of the challenges that we saw, was kind of trying to flip that script on how to do the employer engagement piece. So what do you think, staying with you a little bit, Lillian, what do you think some of those, sort of breakdowns in partnerships, what have you seen?
Well, we saw this early on, and we had to work very diligently to overcome it. So it really started with employers having to understand, what is the benefit? Why should I do this? I'm remarkably busy. I don't have time to waste. And so you're going to have to prove to me what I can get out of this, and that at the end of it all, that I'll have a workforce that I need, and my needs are right now. And so we had to move into action. We formed an advisory group that we referred to as the steering committee. And Cheryl, as you said, we had to bring the right people to the table. And we brought superintendents, which we call in Tennessee directors of schools, presidents of colleges and universities, and leaders in employment. And if we couldn't get those folks, then there was no way we could get the decision makers at the table, and we would not have had action. And so we asked them up front, here's what we're expecting to happen. And if you commit to it and we prove it, I hope you'll stay along for the ride. But if we don't prove it, then I know we can't expect you to stay engaged. And so we were all deeply committed to making that happen. And I often say that, we can provide the table and we can bring people to the table. But at the end of the day, if you don't demonstrate that you can make the changes that are necessary, you're going to lose them. And so we weren't about to waste people's time. And so by, meeting them where they were. And the other part was, asking employers, if we prove to you that we're providing you with what you want, and you get to have a say in what we're actually putting into place in schools, because we made changes with regard to programs of study. We weren't offering the kind of programs that students needed to meet the needs of employers. So advanced manufacturing is a perfect example, and information technology, healthcare, and certainly many others. But we had to make changes in the school systems in order to be able to demonstrate. So Heather knows this very well. If you keep offering the same programs of study and it's not meeting the needs of the employers, then there's no way you can prove to the employers you're trying to fix their challenge, their difficulty in finding the workforce. So I'll stop. There's so much more I could say. I could take up the whole hour talking about that, but I'll let somebody else jump in.
Heather, you want to contribute to this conversation?
Yeah, Lily and I've lived that.
We did.
To her point, I think and Cheryl, something you said that's really crucial is that it starts to break down if you don't have the right person at the right place and the right time. And so I do think it's honoring their time if you're an advisory board member, but that's probably a different person when you start digging into the knowledge and skills within specific positions within Pathways. Right. That's a different person at that company that needs to be involved, right. and making sure that your ask is clear, but the expectations are clear, and that you're honoring that time. So I don't need a CEO to tell me about the specific knowledge and skills of TIG welding, right? But I do need an individual who's actually done that job, or who hires for that job, who can speak to the knowledge and skills. And then the second place I think where we break down is then when those asks need to come with additional supports for employers, in either we don't think to ask them about it, or they don't think to think about it, but in work-based learning, where there might be a training component where we're preparing students to enter into the workplace and be partnered and paired with employers, that sometimes there's an equal training that's necessary of the employers to be able to understand how for the first time taking a student into a work-based learning setting or a mentorship program and what that looks like, especially when you're talking about a diverse set of learners, and making sure that we are kind of cross-training. So again, the expectations are clear across all the stakeholders who are involved. And so I think those are kind of those two big pieces, is being clear on the ask, making sure you do have the right person at the right time for the right task, and then ensuring that you're putting in the support systems necessary for them to actually meet those expectations.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Grace, what have you guys seen? I mean, you guys have been super successful with P-TECH and sort of driving these great dual enrollment high schools. Like, what challenges have you guys seen and breakdowns that have occurred?
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of onus on business in terms of the partnership, and really understanding that schools are student-centered and they need to take the lead. So it's a lot about listening and the communication piece. Of course, you know, employers do want to see a ROI on their efforts, and that means in terms of talent, it means in terms of their own employee base and retention and recruitment and all of those good things. But if we're really going to be at the table to make changes within education, help all students achieve at a higher level, I think it really is a matter of being serious about the kind of commitment that you're going to make, and having the educators and employers be really explicit about what it is that they want to achieve, formally commit to a set of action steps where there's clear roles and responsibilities about who is doing what. And in that, I mean, I think that level of seriousness of even signing a formal agreement helps to solidify in everybody's mind that this is something that we're really going to hold your feet to the fire to, and everybody has some skin in the game. I think, you know, our schools are so busy and our educators are so busy. I think employers really need to think about, okay, is this contribution we're making truly a value add? You know, we don't want to do anything that adds burden on teachers. And so what is it that we're really doing that's contributing to schools and helping us fulfill a shared agenda?
Thank you for that. I wanted to shift maybe a little bit and start talking, if we can, and you know, you'll have much to, all of you will have much to contribute here, but how do these partnerships occur? Let's start talking a little bit about examples. We certainly have tons on our end, and I think to your point, Grace, which is the onus is on employers, like that has been sort of our approach, is like, there's a lot that needs to happen on our end before we can just start saying, you're not giving us what we want. And so, you know, our approach has been to go to, you know, people like chambers, economic development organizations, the places where employers generally come together. And that way also we can get at the small to medium sized businesses, right, who aren't an IBM maybe that can create the P-TECH programs. They maybe don't have the resources or the ability, but coming together as a collective and making some, you know, working together to identify the skills, and also really at the community level, right? We can't be really having these conversations at, you know, sort of the national level is not all that useful. It really has to happen at the local level. So would love to dig in a little bit on what are those examples of what good looks like. Grace, you want to start us off?
Yeah, and Cheryl, you mentioned P-TECH, which is a signature program that IBM has been involved in. Heather knows all about it, but we've been doing this for the past 10 years. And it is really a new way of high school. So it's expanding high school to grades 9 through 14. Students graduate with both their high school diploma and an industry recognized associate's degree. Everything about P-TECH is partnership. It's a collaboration between a high school, a community college partner, and an industry partner, all providing their best expertise to ensure that students are prepared with the skills and competencies necessary for either going on for more college or for entering into what we at IBM call new collar jobs. So those jobs that are truly competitive, 21st century jobs that are well paying and competitive. Industry plays a really important part in the model. We provide a set of workplace experiences. One of the very first things that we do is we communicate the skills that we need and looking toward the future. And so that our education partners, our high school and community college partners, can build the curriculum that leads to those skills. And then we take an active part in really nurturing the talent. So we provide mentors and worksite visits, paid internships when students turn 16 and have some college credit under their belt. And then when students graduate, they're first in line for jobs with their employer partner, which is not a guarantee of a job, but it does mean that you get a guaranteed interview for an appropriate position, which is really significant. When you're that young and you get an opportunity to explain yourself beyond your one-page resume. The model is cost-free. There are no costs to the students, so we're working at the state level with policy makers to make that happen. And it's open enrollment, so it is geared towards students who are first in their families to graduate with a college degree. We've seen some really big results. We've got now more than 600 industry partners that are involved. And Cheryl, as you said, it's not just about the big partners, even though we've got American Airlines and other big players who are participating in the model, but we also have smaller industries also involved, small and medium. So we have 600 business partners across 240 schools. We're in 11 states in the US and 28 countries now. So it's really growing because everyone recognizes that there's both a skills gap and an opportunity gap, and that we have to come together into public-private ecosystems in order to be able to really address education equity and workforce inclusion more and more. IBM's now hired more than 60 students into IBM, so which is incredible to see students go from P-Tech students to now my colleagues in different areas within the company. I think what makes the partnership strong is this idea, again, that we're all at the table as full partners, sharing our very best expertise. We're all responsible for the success of the school and the success of the students, but we're all in our lanes. We're all in our appropriate lanes, giving advice and guidance on the things that we're actually really good at. I think being very explicit about the skills that are needed is a huge part of the model as well, with industry being able to articulate what it is that they need, and then working with educators at the high school and community college level to make sure that the content really ladders up to that. And then we sign MOUs. So everything is about signing a set of commitments that clearly articulates what it is that each partner is responsible for. And we're also constantly talking. So we have regular steering committee meetings. And as Heather Lillian said, we make sure the right people are there. So we have key decision makers who are at the table, who are ready to make decisions. And we're constantly assessing our work. So we're looking at the data, we're making course corrections, we're never satisfied with where we are, and really thinking about, okay, what are the things that we're going to improve upon with the model? And then Cheryl, just to, go back to what you were saying is, employers are such a big part of the model, and we've reached out through chambers of commerce, through community-based organizations to make sure that we get the right level of participation and involvement. If there's any partner that is not carrying the same weight of effort and the same level of commitment, the school is just not going to be as strong. So we are really serious when we talk to other employers about what does it take to really serve as an industry partner for a school. On the one hand, we don't want to scare anyone away, but on the other hand, if you're not going to be able to really fulfill the needs of a school, then it's not the right school partnership for you, and there's probably something different that would be the right way for you to engage with schools.
Yeah. I would just encourage anyone, if they have an opportunity to visit a P-TECH school, it's a wonderful experience to see. And I had the opportunity to see it in Connecticut several years ago. But one of the things
Yeah, I remember.
that I think, what good looks like in any of these is there's a commonality and many things, I'm sure, but one that always struck me, and it struck me there, was leadership. Not just leadership from IBM, obviously, and in their investment, and they're putting people that, like, that's what their job is to work, with these schools, but also leadership of the community college folks, because, like, they got to be on board with this too. And it's not, so anyway, I just, across a lot of these issues when it comes to education workforce, obviously leadership across the board is where you see these things really working well, I think. Heather, do you want to continue the conversation, add maybe some what you've seen?
Sure. I think, echoing what Grace said, it is intentionality that really makes the difference in partnerships from both sides. And I think also being super honest about what types of opportunities there are to engage with employers. There can be partnerships that are really amazing in really small areas that kind of run the gambit from just participating in a career fair all the way through, actually hosting a capstone work-based learning experience. I think when you're clear on those opportunities, it allows employers to dip their toes in where they're comfortable and then grow that relationship over time and have them kind of expand their footprint rather than just asking for everything at the beginning. And I think it also goes a long way in that first ask doesn't come with a monetary request, but that it actually comes with a request of a specific action or time. Some of the successful things, I think I'll actually speak to kind of the different side of it in terms of educator support, right? So where we have teacher externships, where employers are partnering with teachers to prepare them in content areas because the workforce is shifting so quickly. So how do you ensure that teachers are prepared with the knowledge and skills to stay up to date and provide those students with the most up-to-date knowledge and skills? Successful experiences, I know Lillian could probably speak to this more than me, but there's counties in Tennessee with partnerships with employers who actually provide their staff member as a full-time teacher. And that is their commitment, is to actually build that program by offering a person to teach the program. And many different others. But Cheryl, I also wanted to hit on one thing that you said, which is leadership. And I think what also makes a successful partnership is, and again, Lillian can definitely speak to this piece even more than I could, intermediaries in this space. So where partnerships have a common person that they go to, a common person who can connect not just K-12, but community colleges. I think to your point, serving on 5 advisory committees is not an effective use of time when you all hit on similar topics. But when you have a partnership that kind of connects those right stakeholders across the board so that you do get the right person in the right role, and they're not having to have that right role spread across 5 different committees, they can kind of go to one person in one place to apply that expertise across the board, really kind of hits home for that successful partnership.
Totally agree. Lillian?
I'll jump in because there's so much packed into this conversation. I think it was Heather, it may have been you, Cheryl, that mentioned the fact that, we do have a steering committee and we do have subcommittees. And those subcommittees are the ones that they're the boots on the ground. They're the ones who make everything happen. And you're right in that you have to have the right level at the steering committee and another level at the subcommittee level. And we've had so many wonderful examples that it would take a lot of time to share all of them. But one perfect example, we did become a member of Pathways to Prosperity. We were one of the first to join that particular network. And based on that and the feedback from employers and labor market data, we launched advanced manufacturing as a pathway. We were doing nothing in the school systems to prepare students for that pathway. And that was actually an industry that was growing here in the region. And so existing industries struggling to get their workforce, bringing on new ones. We stacked hands, found out what exactly all the advanced manufacturing companies needed. And it was determined that mechatronics would be the right program to offer in high school under advanced manufacturing. And we actually had to apply for a grant to be able to fund that equipment in the school systems. And today we have a very successful program in multiple high schools across the region. And we started out with no students in that pathway, and it grows exponentially every year. When I left my job as an intermediary, I think we had over 600 that were in that pipeline. And that simply would not have happened if we didn't have engaged employers working directly with education, and not just K through 12 or secondary ed, but certainly with in Tennessee, we have Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology, as well as, of course, community colleges and universities. So getting them all together and working in their own particular lane and what they can do, and have articulation agreements between one to the other, from the high school to the Tennessee College of Applied Technology, to the two-year institution, and so on. So I think that's a perfect example of it working well and demonstrating to the employers that we mean what we say, and the educators came to the table and made the necessary change. And Grace said something earlier, and I know for IBM and certainly for much larger companies, it's a bit different, where you may believe that, and it is true, that you have a role and a responsibility to play, and you reach out to schools. But in rural areas where I am, the employers didn't know what to do. And they didn't think they had to count on education, although they were frustrated and they knew they weren't getting what they needed, but they didn't know who was going to help them with that. And so that's where, in my case as an intermediary, I could jump in. And again, as I said, we bring everybody together to execute the change. And so there are many more examples of that.
Yeah, we probably need a session just on examples. We could share a lot, I'm sure. We can't have really any conversation these days without and not talk about the global pandemic and COVID and its impact on just everything that we do. So how is it affecting partnerships between schools and employers, and what are some of the opportunities or challenges that we see right now? Lillian, we'll stick with you. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and I think we all know there's no question about this. Schools were spending so much time getting ready to open schools. They were so focused on the safety and health of their faculty, as well as their students. And so the same was really true of employers. Employers, are at great risk if their workforce is sick. It's a struggle on any given day to have them come to work on just a normal time, but then you add to the mix a pandemic, and then you can't afford to have a production line shut down, or whatever line of business that you're in, because your employees are sick and you can no longer get the work done. And then there are those who simply have shut down, and those who have hunkered down, and they're saying, we have to stay focused within. We cannot engage to the same level or degree that we did before. That's not to say that they're not still engaged, but what we've had to do is make adjustments, and of course now meet virtually. There's no meeting in person, and it's meeting less frequently to keep the contact, to keep the conversation going, and to continue to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening. Because what we have found over the course of many years is that creative solutions come when you're meeting with each other. And if you stop meeting, then you lose that opportunity to find out where there may be a solution to a problem that an employer is experiencing because of COVID-19. So I'm thrilled that our teams are still meeting. It's just not where it needs to be. And of course, we have to respect that. There's no forcing it. You cannot force it. People are living in fear, and we just have to recognize that. And plus, they're trying to survive. And so I think we do have opportunities to stay connected as the way that they want to stay connected. Leave them alone when they want to be left alone. But continue to meet where you can and think about those creative solutions, because I think they're there. And they'll be uncovered by communicating.
Grace, how are you seeing it play out for you guys?
I'll go. So with COVID, we've had to pivot. So much of what we do, and I think we're always in schools. We have employees in schools as mentors. We have students who are coming to IBM to serve an internship. So we really had to think about, okay, how are we going to continue to make impact during this period where I, for one, am talking to you today from my dining room. So, we're thinking, we've been in the initial days, we were focused on thinking about students who didn't have hardware and connectivity and how we could fill those immediate gaps, working with our school partners. And now we've pivoted a lot of our activities online. So we're doing online mentoring for students. By the end of December next year, we'll have provided at least 1,000 virtual internships for students, which we still think is valuable because that's how much IBMers work virtually anyway. So it's good for students to learn how to work in an online environment. We're doing lots of webinars and contests all online and opening them up not just to P-TECH students, but to students worldwide. We have an online learning platform on emerging technologies and professional competencies called Open P-TECH, and have made that universally available for free, knowing that it's not going to be top of mind for educators everywhere because there's a lot of very serious issues to deal with, but knowing too that there may be students and teachers who are going to be able to take advantage of those kinds of things. My hope is that if something good's coming out of COVID, it's one that it's really highlighting the fact, the net inequities that are existing between our communities. And obviously there's so much that has to be done in terms of, Wi-Fi access. But I think in terms of employer partnerships with schools, I hope that what it does is it makes everybody think about how do you reach out to school, low-income schools. How do we think about what can employers do in terms of the tremendous loss of learning that's been going on through all of these past months, and that we really take the moment to think about, okay, how do we rethink partnerships that we have, and how do we pivot to this new normal that we all know that we're going to become part of. I mean, schools are just not going to go back to what they were. So, it gives us time, I think, to think differently and to innovate. I think it's a time of tremendous learning, and we've got to capitalize on that and do things differently.
Yeah. Heather, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of three consistencies in an inconsistent time, which is one, time. To Lillian's point, everybody, K-12, higher ed, employers are scrambling. And I think you have to be careful about your asks and when is the right time for that ask. I think there's been consistency and inconsistency. So the best laid plans have changed and changed again. And you're in a setting, you're out of a setting, and that changes on the daily. And so I think this flexibility has been for sure the case, especially, even for employers, right? I mean, schools absolutely who are feeling it. I think even for employers who change not just how they manufacture, produce something, but in instances, what they manufacture and produce, right, has fundamentally shifted. And I think to Grace's point, the biggest thing that we are seeing is this gap in equity of opportunity. And so for people who have been able to shift quickly into online, doesn't still ensure that you have equitable access and then consistency in equitable access, right? And so even for programs that can be shifted, I think you've heard about the digital divide, and you're starting to see different programs in place to support students with equipment and access to then be able to reach it. But I think that's going to continue to be a thing and hopefully bring communities together to solve, because to your point, it's not just an education issue, it's an economic mobility issue. And that applies not just to the K-12 space, but higher ed and adult learners, especially in this retooling and refocusing piece. So I'd say those are connecting to Lillian and Grace's points, kind of the big things we're seeing, and not just in one community, it's across states and across communities.
Yeah.
And if I could add, Cheryl, if it's okay, yesterday's EdVision session with Governor Jeb Bush and several distinguished panelists, I was really struck by what Jonathan Edelstein said. We all know that there is a shortage of the workforce in information technology, and he was stressing how prior to COVID-19, it was a huge issue for his company. And we were talking a lot, they were talking a lot about broadband access, as we all have, and certainly the digital divide. And Larry Irving was a part of that panel, and he was the one that coined the phrase, the digital divide. And it struck me, especially as I thought about today's conversation, that we do have a golden opportunity. And they talked about that too. When you think about equitable access, from having simply access to broadband, to the internet, they talked about it in two different ways, and that's not the point that I want to make. But I think about it when, you can be anywhere, you can work anywhere. You can be in an urban area, you can be in a rural area, and you can work for any company. You don't have to be in the same country, let alone the same state or city. So I think we have a golden opportunity that we need to figure out how we can seize it and begin preparing more and more students for the information technology age. Because one of the things that Edelstein spoke about was, we have to scale up to be able to provide that broadband access. And we don't have enough people to do that. And so we're already way behind the 8 ball. And so I think if we can figure out how to seize that opportunity, then equitable access is not just in access to the technology, but it's in access to job, into a viable future for myself. So I wanted to just add that extra point.
No, thank you for doing that. And I want to just remind folks to submit questions in the chat. We have, before we shift there, I did want to at least just touch on this last question that because I do think it's really important, and it touches on the digital divide. And at least from our perspective, we think about, how do we sustain these things that we're talking about? How do we move them from boutique, nice programs that hit a handful of students to more, scalable across? And policy just is a really important piece to that. And it's one of the things that we always encourage, obviously on the chamber side with our employer members. It's, if you think you're going to solve your workforce challenges by getting kids after they've graduated high school, like, forget about it, right? Like, you've got to get engaged earlier, and it's not just engaged with partnerships, but it's engaged with policy. And there's a strong role for employers there, but there's a strong role for lots of folks in the policy and advocacy space. So I just wanted to say, sort of, how can policymakers support the kinds of things we've been talking about? And I don't know, let's start with you, Heather.
Yeah. I think I'll say from a state level, in previous experience at the state level, it's one, I think you have to model the behavior that you want. So if you're looking for strong partnerships between education and employers, then you should start to model that at the state level. So who are the employers, who are the associations, who are the chambers that you're working with at the state level to build that system that can then be mimicked down. And the second piece I'll say is that though there are huge, big policy changes that can be made, it never ceased to amaze me at how often it was a little p policy that really needed to be changed. So identifying those barriers that are standing in the way of those partnerships. And if I had to put a number on it, I would say 75% of the time, it was a little p policy that could be changed in a relatively short amount of time, not a huge, legislative act that needed to change the ship around. And so I think identifying those barriers and being willing and flexible to change and shift, and then modeling those expectations that you want to see at the local level.
Lillian, you want to chime in here?
Sure. When you think about policymakers, certainly you have the State Board of Education, and we are tasked with education policy for the state of Tennessee. You also have your legislative body. And I think a lot of times we live in these silos, and we work very hard to get outside of those silos to make sure that we're communicating with one another and we're all on the same page. Because there are times that, to make the kind of change that we want to make, it does take certain legislative change. And so we can certainly have those partnerships and make sure that at my level at the state board that we can be having those conversations. But it does take funding. I mean, I'm here to tell you, you cannot, I wish I could say, because there are some things you can do without money, and there's certain things that you cannot do without money. Like I said, we could not have put in mechatronics in high school if we didn't have access to grant funding. And so, you can start out asking for the support that we would like to have from the federal government, certainly the state and the local. I think we need to include philanthropic organizations in the discussion. But school systems have limited human and financial resources, and there are times that they do need additional resources to have stronger and more highly effective engagement with employers. And so that's how we've been successful so far. But to continue that, we certainly have to have additional policy that allows us to move into that arena. And so to me, it's, I don't like talk for the sake of talk. I want it to be action oriented, but for us to move the needle in the right direction and to have higher engagement, I think it takes all of us stacking hands with each other and committing to and agreeing what that looks like. Because, I've asked the question about the digital divide. We have this broadband access issue. How are we going to address it? And it's, the states cannot do it alone. Federal support is needed, and it does take money. But guess what? We heard from Mr. Edelstein. It takes the workforce, so it takes the engagement of various sectors. So I'll leave it at that, because I'll tell you, the state board, we've made some changes based on what Heather just said. Some little changes, and in some cases some larger, getting rid of programs of study that were no longer useful and they weren't serving any purpose, and putting in place those that were meaningful, that allowed for higher engagement with employers and information technology, and changing the course offerings, because what we were offering was not exactly what employers were looking for. And the same is true with health sciences and information technology and advanced manufacturing. Yeah. So.
Grace, did you, I'm certain that there was, numerous opportunities where you all needed policymaker support across the board. So any examples you want to share?
Yeah, we've with PTEC, we've actually had legislation passed in four different states, enabling the model, so de-siloing the system, enabling funding, so that students can be in high school for up to 6 years, although we have students who accelerate through the model. I think what's important for policy is to really have that thread through, and really be comprehensive and think, how do we fund a program where we know kids are moving through the K-12 system into college and then through employment, and that there's a consistent and comprehensive funding policy, and then obstacles that will create any barriers for those kinds of partnerships will be eliminated, and funding can be used also as an incentive for educators and employers to come together. I'd also say that policy also exists within the private sector, and we need to also look at hiring policy and think about who can lead and who can work, and be much more expansive about our talent pipeline, and not just look in places where we traditionally look for talent. And that means a focus on skills, and not just credentials, making sure that we're hiring for diversity into jobs up a career ladder, and affording people the opportunity to be in school and at work at the same time. So I think there's public policies, but also private policies as well.
Yeah. I'm going to ask this question, one of the questions coming in from the audience, but I think it is a good one for you, Grace, was the question of what kind of student outcomes do you measure to know if your efforts are working and are impactful? I know that's obviously a focus of y'all's, is to be data driven. So what are those student outcomes?
Yeah, we're looking at a huge range of things: attendance, high school performance, college readiness, performance in college, attainment of jobs, students who go on for more college. We're looking at also just the number of interactions that employers and have with in terms of the mentoring and making sure every student gets a paid internship. So we're looking at a huge range of data, both quantitative and also qualitative.
Heather, Lillian, do either of you want to weigh in on that question? I've got more here in the chat, if not.
I think that's right. And I appreciate Grace's focus on the outcomes more than the outputs, right?
Yeah. One question here, what areas do you believe K through 12 can do to better, am I reading this? Sorry. What areas do you believe K through 12 can do to better prepare students? What are the areas that K through 12 can do better to prepare students to enter industry? Who wants to grab that? Heather or Lillian?
Sure.
I'll jump in. You know, what we heard first in the beginning from employers, besides the skills which you work on through the career technical education side of it, we heard all of the soft skills. And so that is something that educators said to us in our discussions. Do they expect us to teach those soft skills too? And I said, well, yes, I think that, you know, embedding them in your lesson plans is the logical thing to do. But we didn't take that for granted and just allow that to lay on the table and not take action on that. And Heather, you know, from working with the TDOE that soft skills were then included in every level of standards to ensure that they were being addressed. You know, there's certain ones that are more challenging, and showing up on time, that's certainly thread through all of the things that we try to accomplish. But there's certain things that are a struggle universally across this country. And it's unfortunately something that's hard for us to address. And it's the usage of drugs. And I don't know what Grace might be doing at IBM, but I know that a lot of companies have implemented their own programs to try to address it. But it shuts out a lot of people who are not being addressed in terms of how can we stop this? Because I always think about root cause and how do you go back to the root cause and address it. But that's across the board, and there are unfortunately school systems that have children that are using drugs on campus, and so that's one that's more difficult and challenging to tackle. Sorry, I brought up the negative.
No, not at all. Does anybody want to weigh in on that question, or I'd be happy to move on to another one I've got here. What is the best way for states to, this might be one for you as well, Lillian, but what is the best way for states to figure out how to offer educational opportunities in areas like IT, AI, et cetera, that are changing so rapidly?
I wish I could say that I have a silver bullet for that one, because as I mentioned earlier, I think it's one that we all have an opportunity to figure out collectively, because we've been talking about it, and I get frustrated with conversation. I want us to figure out how to do it. And I think that, you know, you struggle with certainly the larger more metropolitan and urban areas. You have the IT companies, and so you're looking at the immediate need of those companies, and it's one thing to address their needs, but we're not necessarily having all the right players at the table. So the telecommunication companies, the broadband companies, they need to be a part of this equation so that we can address the things we heard yesterday from Larry Irving and Mr. Edelstein. And so I think we have a clear opportunity to put it on the table and bring the right people to the table, the decision makers who can in fact make the kind of change that's necessary to move the needle in the right direction. That's what I think Tennessee needs to do. And that's what I want to be a part of, being a catalyst to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, I can't believe, I don't want to, I guess I should just say, Grace or Heather, do you have anything you want to add to those conversations? I can't believe we got like 1 minute before we end, but I don't want to be the last one to speak if you guys want to add something as well. We're good? Well, I hope, I mean, this was fascinating for me, and I think we could all talk about this for hours and hours, but I want to thank so much Grace and Lillian and Heather, and for allowing me to step in and be a part of this conversation. Just a couple things in wrapping up. The recordings of all of the EdPalooza sessions are available to attendees for 30 days. Please keep the conversation going on social media with the hashtag EdPalooza. For more information on anything that you've heard today, please reach out to ExcelinEd, www.excelined.org, or connect on social @ExcelinEd.